Sorry, everybody. I'm glad to be here with all of you. I'm going to change the tenor of the conversation, I suppose, a little bit because I'm coming at this from a music perspective. I'm a musician. Do we have any other musicians in the audience? Fantastic. Okay. Great, great, great. And how many of you are students right now? Have any grad students with us? Fabulous, very good. And I'm curious how many of you have attended one of these cultural diplomacy conferences in the past? Oh, good. Well, some people are way ahead of me. This is brand new. When Mark invited me to do this talk, I was looking for something that would link some essential factor about cultural diplomacy and music. And the common denominator I came up with is empathy. It's the ability to see the world from someone else's perspective, to feel their feelings. And I think this is absolutely the foundation of all cultural diplomacy. And the cool thing about music is that music is in some ways a fast track to empathy. So I'm planning on talking a little bit about how that works, the link between music and cultural diplomacy. And I also want to talk about nation branding and storytelling with some examples of the US situation. So let me start out here. I chose an odd, maybe sounding title, Narco music. It's a reference to the drug-like capacity of music. The way it functions in some ways like a narcotic. So they've done these studies that show that music produces dopamine, which is a pleasure-producing agent, which is the same thing that happens with cocaine, only a different amount. Music also lowers cortisol, which is a stress hormone. Studies found that people who listen to music before going into surgery require less anesthesia. And music also releases serotonin, a neurotransmitter associated with feelings of euphoria and contentment. But here's the kicker. Studies have shown that singing in groups produces what's known as a singer's high, and it's actually a blast of oxytocin, which manages stress and anxiety and produces feelings of bonding and trust. Bonding and trust is where we get to empathy. And again, if you're going to have shared understanding between any people, between any countries, this is all founded on empathy. But there's more. Researchers have found in studying children ages 8 to 11 that when they participate in regular group music activities, that their capacity, that their development of empathy is advanced significantly. So I just want to point out the two factors here. That singer's high that we've talked about and the advancement of empathy development all come from when people are making music together. So this isn't sitting passively as an audience member, it's actually making music together. So one way to think about this is in your next diplomatic conversation, your next tough negotiation, maybe you ought to get people together and sing before you start. Music is powerful, its effects are multi-layered, and in some ways this makes it a perfect tool for cultural diplomacy. And I wanted to show you how this works. Can we play this? Yes. Underscore a few things from that clip, which I find fascinating. In the end there, Barenboim was asked, will music create peace? And he was saying that in the end, what happens in this orchestra is two people are sitting side by side on the same music stand. And it's because they're sharing a goal together that they actually change their view of what it is to be human. This was what the young pianist said, that side by side, you stop seeing the other person as the other. It goes from us versus them to we. And he said that he's not looking for political consensus, that for him, consensus over Beethoven is enough. I'm not sure that that's enough for all of us here, but what I would say is that it's a starting point. It's this essential place where you can connect on a human level. I just love how he points out how this actually happens. And when we think about it, when you're sitting on that same music stand, 6 hours of rehearsals, and you're caring about the same thing, just to keep in mind that what you're surrounded with, you're kind of bathed in these chemicals that your brain is producing that cement these feelings of bond and trust. So if you're thinking that the same thing can happen when you have people united over science projects or other kinds of things, that's the fallacy. There is something very specific going on with music. It's not only a gateway for empathy, it also functions as a terrific storytelling medium, which is the primary function that I believe cultural diplomacy operates in. We are needing to tell the stories of our nation. So I wanted to give an example. The U.S. State Department funded jazz greats such as Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Count Basie for diplomatic tours around the world from the 1950s to the 70s. These were Cold War era goodwill missions designed to enhance the American image abroad by telling what was then considered the American story. So here we go with the storytelling. The interesting thing for me, from a musician's point of view, is that jazz itself tells a very important part of this story. Jazz is improvisatory. It honors both the freedom of the individual as well as the cohesive whole of the ensemble. So in a way, jazz is a political statement all to itself. So in performance, the jazz story, you might say, is about freedom, cooperation, creativity, hope, and self-expression. And added to this, for those diplomatic tours that were held, there's an important other added dimension. These were African American musicians. And so the part of the story that was layered onto this was the idea that America was attempting to raise ourselves beyond the shameful history of slavery, and that we were holding jazz as an art form and these particular jazz artists as among our most treasured national achievements, I would say. This analyzing of what the cultural diplomacy initiative is analyzing the story, is not unlike what you might see in a Mad Men episode when they're sort of picking apart whether an ad works. So this is nation branding. And I find myself wondering about what is the story that's being told about America when the New York Philharmonic performs in North Korea. Because of course there's the story we intend to tell, and then there's the story that's actually communicated, and these are not always the same. We can also look at storytelling in a business context. Effective marketing is all about making an emotional connection with customers through storytelling, and with the aim of getting people to do something, to act on an impulse. It's a call to action. In this, from a business point of view, it's to purchase a product. Well, how does this apply to cultural diplomacy? Music, because of its ability to catalyze feelings and connect people emotionally, is the perfect delivery vehicle for empathy building and storytelling. Once people are emotionally charged, they are motivated to act. In a cultural diplomacy context, the action might be to engage in dialogue, to cultivate political, economic, and cultural relationships. And the ultimate goals might be for things like trade agreements, settling of disputes, or encouraging cross-border alliances. But I think it's worth stepping back and asking yourself, what's the starting point for all of this? It doesn't happen with a single performance of a touring international artist, and it doesn't happen with a few isolated master classes or workshops given with local musicians. Empathy, like relationships, is cultivated through shared experience and meaningful transactions over time. So for those of you who are programming the arts events in your diplomatic capacities and want to make the most of your country's investment, think about more than exposure through performances, through individual performances, and look for in-depth shared transactions. I'd also recommend that you keep in mind that the best storytellers are always the best listeners. So to bring this more up to date from the Cold War period Goodwill Jazz Tours, I wanted to take a look at the reality the U.S. faces now, because any of the artistic, diplomatic, cultural diplomatic initiatives that the U.S. might initiate now, in effect, are drowned out by the noise of American popular culture in the form of Hollywood movies, television, pop music, whether these have been paid for or not. And what overwhelms even the ubiquitous influence of American popular culture is the reality of U.S. military interventions. Our image abroad is all about our dominant exports, television shows such as Sex and the City, along with Scud missiles and drone strikes. In the most cynical light, cultural diplomacy might be seen as window dressing, as putting lipstick on a pig. Or we might think of this in the form of nation branding as artistic pimping in the name of national self-interest with a veneer of goodwill. But I think it's worth pointing out a third essential sphere of influence after pop music and military intervention. And I'm thinking of the U.S. higher education system. I'm referring to the hundreds of thousands of international students who are enrolled in U.S. colleges and then return to their home countries inoculated, for better or for worse, with an American education, a sense of an alternative lifestyle, and a valued degree. For all the struggles of U.S. colleges and universities, and we are definitely in a time of flux now, an American college education is still a prized possession. At the school where I teach, Manhattan School of Music, just uptown from here, it's one of the nation's top conservatories. The student population is nearly 40% international. And the top two countries, of course we're getting fabulous musicians from these days, are China and Korea. While in school, these fabulous musicians are making music together in a truly international environment, and they are building empathy and a shared understanding. Music students come to the U.S. for arguably the best music training in the world, but all international students graduate with far more than a degree. They return home with a new way of seeing themselves and a new way of understanding the world. So what is the American story we are presenting to the world? Yes, if we think in terms of the story told through the most popular U.S. television shows being consumed abroad, such as Jersey Shore and Desperate Housewives, we might be seen, of course, as a culture of consumer-obsessed, vain, and violent people without moral centers. But if we think of the best of what we send abroad, what I see are thousands of talented musicians trained in the U.S. going back to their home countries with the skills and determination to become entrepreneurial agents of change. These are ambitious, idealistic young people who will use music to build empathy and to tell their own stories, but perhaps with just a hint of American brand freedom, creativity, cooperation, self-expression, and above all, hope. For those of you who are or who will be determining the cultural programming within the diplomatic service in some capacity, I'd recommend you analyze the message that cultural diplomacy initiatives are actually communicating. And I'd challenge you to create opportunities for ongoing shared experience through music. Thank you.